Hi, I'm Jake. I'm a park ranger here in the Blind Eternities. Each and every person that explores this broad expanse of Magic the Gathering is looking for something just a little bit different. And I guarantee whatever you're looking for, it's probably a little bit different than what I'm looking for. And what I'm looking for is probably a little bit different than what you're looking for. And chances are there's going to be a couple things that we're looking for that the other person finds absolutely abhorrent. But that's the cool thing about Magic. I believe that every strategy can be built at every level. And no matter what you're looking to get out of the game, I believe there's a way to do it. So you're gonna have to bear with me on this one, but I believe there is no unfun strategies in Magic the Gathering. Now, I think we've all had the experience of sitting down at a table and playing an excruciatingly long game of Magic, only for it to end in a loss. That extreme, unfun experience. But I believe that that's not necessarily due to unfun strategies. I think we need to separate the experience of the gameplay from the strategy itself. And I believe there's a way to make every strategy work at every level. There are ways of playing bracket 1 combo decks, and there are ways of playing bracket 5 stompy decks. They just look a little bit different depending on the power level you're playing and the actual strategy that you are trying to employ. So today I want to walk through a few specific unfun strategies and talk about ways that you can make them work a little bit better. Because at the end of the day, our strategy, our goal, is to win the game. And your strategy needs to accomplish that. So let's begin with the one strategy that comes to mind immediately when someone says unfun. Let's talk about land destruction. So when we talk about land destruction as an unfun strategy, I think there's one card that comes to mind above all others. And if you've been playing the game long enough, I'm sure you've seen it. That card is Armageddon. It's a very simple oracle text. Destroy all lands. It includes your own, but usually if you're running Armageddon, you're using a deck that can capitalize on that symmetry between the different players at the table. I run this card in exactly 2 decks. One of them is in my Super Friends Atraxa deck, because even without lands, as long as I have a couple planeswalkers in play doing their thing, I'm going to close out the game. And the other deck that I have this in is my Necrobloom deck. This deck is very focused on lands and has a lot of ways of getting lands back from the graveyard. Both of these decks are obviously fairly high bracket 4 decks. And in my Necrobloom deck, I'm running a variety of cards that allow me to destroy all lands. In addition to Armageddon, I'm running Deathcloud to make everybody sacrifice lands and creatures. I have a bunch of tokens, I don't care about that. And I'm also running Desolation Angel. Blow up all lands, get a beat stick. Generally good all-around card. But here's the thing. A lot of the games where you struggle with mass land destruction, it's because the player that casts the mass land destruction doesn't have a follow-up. When I cast Armageddon, there's a couple of cards that you are guaranteed to see immediately following it. One of them is Lumra. Return all lands from my graveyard to play. And it gets real big. So that Armageddon didn't set me back at all, and I'm in a winning position. The other is Faith's Reward. There's a couple cards with this effect, but Faith's Reward is a little bit unique in that it is only your own stuff. So your lands that went down get to come back. Same thing with creatures. So this is a really useful card to recover from some symmetrical board wipes as well. Just generally good to have in a white deck if you're playing a deck that wants to leave mana open. But if we're not playing in that high bracket 4, I think this deck looks a little bit different. Obviously, there's a lot of different ways of building Necrobloom, but let's say we want to stick with that land destruction sub-theme. We're going to essentially lose this whole top end of land removal, because all of these are either game changers or mass land destruction, and so there's not a lot of good ways of fitting that into the deck. But we can still run some of this land recovery, and using lands that sacrifice for value can still give us a pretty full graveyard. There's other cards that we can use like Reap and Sow and one fully Acid Moss to take out some of our opponent's lands while ramping ourselves. All of these are excellent cards to include in the deck. We have the capacity to recover from bigger catastrophes, and so our goal with this deck, even leaning into that mass land destruction, I think is to cause those catastrophes. And there's a few different ways we can do that. One of my favorite ways to do that is by holding up Natural Affinity. You can turn all lands into 2/2 creatures. In a deck that ramps really hard and puts out a ton of creatures, or a bunch of lands, this can also close out the game on its own by giving you that walking army to trample over your opponents. But it does something else. If your opponent casts Wrath of God, in response, you can trick them into casting their own Armageddon by turning everybody's lands into those creatures. This is going to be somewhat more symmetrical because you're also losing access to your board, but again, with some of the other cards we have, like our Faith's Reward, there it is, we can get all those back. And so for the low cost of 7 mana, you're left with your board while your opponent is left with nothing. But there's one more card that I really like to run in any deck that can run it, and that is Casualties of War. This is a really cool politics card. It allows you to pick off a variety of different targets from everyone's board at the same time. And you get this kind of shared animosity amongst people, where everybody wants certain permanents on their opponent's board gone, and as long as you're pointing to those, nobody's too likely to counter this. It allows you to also get rid of that one problem land that's causing issues. Last night I was up against a deck with a Shifting Woodlands that kept conspicuously transforming into a Magus of the Candelabra to produce near infinite mana. It was kinda gross. But with cards like this, we can take care of some of those before they become a problem. But we still need something a little more impactful. Something that isn't hit by those same bracket restrictions, and I think one of my favorite cards to play is Natural Balance. It's an old reserve list card, so you might not have seen this before, and I'm also unsure whether this counts as mass land destruction. It's been left a little bit fuzzy on the exact definition of that. But what Natural Balance does is equalize everybody to 5 lands. If somebody's ramped really hard and is at 8, 9, 10 lands, it can look like they're not doing much, but in actuality, they are extremely far ahead. This brings them back in line. And that player that was stuck on 2 lands since the beginning of the game, this might give them a chance. Cards like this allow people to actually play the game, and I think that's important for this type of strategy. But more than that, I want to note that even with these mass land destruction strategies, the unfun part comes from the lack of follow-up. A strategy has to have a direction, and when you are casting Armageddon into the void with no other permanents in play just to stall the game, I understand the concept of never give up, never surrender, play to your outs, do whatever you can to keep yourself in the game. That's what makes it unfun. If it doesn't serve your strategy, if you don't have anything that allows you to play lands out of the graveyard or get those lands back to hand, you're just stalling. You are playing not to lose. We need to play to win with these strategies. Magic the Gathering is a game with a very specific goal: to eliminate the other players or win yourself. That's it. And if your strategy doesn't move in that direction, it's just not a good strategy, fun or not. And with that said, let's move on to our second category of commonly assumed unfun strategies: the counterspell deck. I think each and every one of us, at some point in our Magic career, has faced off against that blue deck. You know the one that I'm talking about. The one that does nothing but draw cards and cast counterspells, says no to every single thing that's trying to come down on the board, casting spells that stop you from untapping lands or casting things at instant speed or whatever the case may be, and just stops the game from doing things. This type of blue deck can be very frustrating, but the reality is that strategy, as long as it's building card advantage, does lead to a win. If you team up against it, usually you can overwhelm the blue player. In high school, I had a friend who played a deck that we like to call the Counter Buddy deck, because more often than not, the counterspell deck would work until it didn't, and then essentially give somebody the free win as soon as there was an opening. Magic the Gathering is a game built so that over the period of a game, you're playing more lands and you're able to cast more powerful spells, so as soon as there is an opening, you can get through with the most powerful spell yet. So because of that, these blue decks have to be a little careful, a little judicious with the way that they use their cards. There's a deck that I'm building right now using the homunculus from Itherdrift, Venixa with it. That is a counterspell deck focused on drawing cards and being a little more aggressive, I think, than an average blue deck. And the strategy does incorporate a lot of counterspells and a lot of things that mess with your opponent's stuff. But because we have to get some damage in on our opponents, as long as we're starting our engines, we gotta finish our engines, well, we need that aggro element. We need ways of getting through our opponent's defenses, over, under, however we can make it happen. Because then we start drawing 2 cards for every 1 that we would draw. And all of a sudden, we can drown our opponents in our card advantage. I think counterspell decks should have a specific target. Something that they are working towards. And sometimes that goes slow. Sometimes that ends up being infinite turns. And I'm going to be honest with you, if you demonstrate a loop where you have infinite turns, just describe the win condition to me. I'll scoop, I promise. There's usually not a way of breaking out of that with a blue deck, because eventually they're going to get the counter spells to protect themselves anyways, and then there's nothing else we can do. But some people will leave indeterministic combos that sometimes get infinite, sometimes don't, and just generally stall out the game, hoping that something will happen. Or they'll throw some sort of combination of cards in play that make the game pretty brutal to play for themselves. And so then there's no forward progress on anyone's board, and the game feels like it ends in a draw regardless of who eventually breaks through for the win. So when you're building a counterspell deck, I'd encourage you to have some sort of finisher. Usually that's some sort of combo or infinite draw or whatever gets you out of that loop fast. But there needs to be something that gets you out of that loop fast. And that brings us to our next hated mechanic, the next unfun strategy that people like to point to, that's infinite combos. I don't think I have ever seen somebody rage as hard as one particular Friday Night Magic, in which Ashley was able to get Exquisite Blood and Sanguine Bond onto the table at the same time. It was like turn 12. This wasn't early in the game. This was natural. Swamp go, swamp go, swamp go. A few other demons and creatures in play, but eventually hitting those 2 enchantments, activating Ob Nixilis, and dealing infinite damage to the table while gaining infinite life. And it was amazing. It was an explosion from one side of the table. Standing up, slamming his cards in his backpack, outside of the deck box, just swept off the table, saying, "This is ridiculous, this isn't even magic." 2-card combos get people heated. 2-card combos, where one of them is the commander, get people even more heated. And that's why you see it explicitly called out on the bracket guidelines. Fast combos are difficult to interact with, and often leave you without that sense of a game well fought, because there's not a lot of ways to counter those. If you look at Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation to close out a game, as is the case with a lot of CEDH decks, that's a really tough one to interact with. And even if you can interact with it, it's in colors that allow you to protect it fairly easily. But I don't think we should write combo off, because anything where you can pour 7, 8, 9, 10 mana into it and get a win seems reasonable. A lot of those combos that are 2 or 3 cards and require that quantity of mana, I mean, that would be the same as playing a giant infect hasty creature to close out the game, or just dropping an overrun on an army of 2/2 wolves. There's a lot of different ways of winning the game very quickly in Magic, and whether that's a Crater Hoof or an Exquisite Blood Sanguine Bond combo, they feel pretty similar. But there's this weird aversion to combo plays or anything that can really go infinite that you see it showing up on a lot of homebrew ban lists, and I think that's a little weird. The problem is, combos are really hard to ban. If it's not something like Flash Hulk, with exactly one copy of each piece that you have to put together to get the win, I think there's always a backup. If Demonic Consultation and Thassa's Oracle, if either of those were banned, you're moving to Tainted Pact, you're moving to Laboratory Maniac, you're moving to Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, you're running to any number of other cards that allow you to exile your library or care about having an empty library. And those will still be the most popular combos in CEDH. You will still see those in every deck that's running Thassa's Oracle and Demonic Consultation right now. So the reality is, the way those combos interact and the way you build a deck around those combos is a concern of power level and a concern of deck linearity, more so than it is a concern of the fun of that particular interaction. Because if you have a good way of getting to that combo, chances are, even if you're using bracket 1 cards, it's going to feel like a bracket 4 deck. And I strongly encourage you to consider the power level of the way your deck plays more than the power level of the way your deck is built. I talked about this a couple videos ago, but I think that this is something that typically gets people hung up and can lead to some really negative experiences. And it has nothing to do with the combo. It has more to do with the power level of the deck backing that combo up. There's a ton of creature-based combos out there now. As more cards get printed, we're going to see a ton more. And with the number of creature tutors that exist in the game, and land tutors that exist in the game, and combos that can just manifest entirely off of lands, we're going to see those combos popping up here and there. And I think it's on the deck builder and the deck pilot to identify how powerful those combos make the deck. So when you're building one of these combo decks, when you're building a specific interaction into your deck, just bear that in mind. And if you're playing against one of these interactions and you notice that there's combos in here that come out of nowhere and instantly win the game, that's something you have to take into account. And it feels really crummy as someone who's piloting a combo deck to get eliminated before your deck can do anything. If your deck has a habit of winning out of nowhere, you can't really blame them for taking you out early. It's part of the game. And that's the biggest play around for combo decks like that, is get them off the table. Player removal is the best permanent removal. But aside from combos and counters and land destruction, I've heard every other strategy called unfun. I've heard Voltron called unfun. I've seen aggro called unfun. Big Ramp Stompy has been unfun. Stacks is unfun. There's so many strategies in Magic that, if presented at the wrong power level or against people that specifically don't like that style of play, they will feel unfun. I think as long as your strategy fits within that power level and has a specific game plan with a way to progress the game, you're in the clear. Your deck's good. There's a lot of "Am I the butthole" posts on Magic the Gathering's Reddit that ultimately come down to, yeah, your opponent was probably a little bit touchy about this, but also your deck might be a little overtuned for the table at which you're playing. So I'd encourage you to keep that in mind when you're building your deck. If you've had weird experiences that felt specifically unfun because of a specific strategy, I'd love to hear about it. Because I still hold to the fact that there's ways of making these strategies work, and that no blanket statement can be made about any of these strategies. I believe that even at a fairly high-powered table, if you're able to get a turn 2 Smallpox off or a turn 2 Tremble off, where you're able to set people back just one land, you filter through a lot of people that kept risky hands with no way to get to their second mana. It can be pretty mean, but all of those cards are fair game. And if you don't have a deck, or if you didn't mulligan to account for that sort of play, well, maybe you will next time. Maybe that'll be a lesson. Maybe that helps you be a better Magic player. And the next time you see that strategy, you'll be ready.